Hi and welcome to another webinar with Onevinn. And today we also invited Entrust to this webinar. The focus today will be information protection and the different key options that we have both for information and other data in, for instance, in Azure. We will divide this session in 3 different parts. I'm going to start talking about the data and information protection part. And in the next part, Ena from Entrust will talk about everything that you need to know and what you can accomplish with an HSM. And in the last 20 minutes, we're going to leave that for questions and discussions around this really hot topic. So let's kick this off. I'm going to start present and share my screen. First of all, I'm really sorry for a kind of depressing picture. But I can just imagine how it's like today to have a role, for instance, like a chief information security officer or a similar role at a company today, most of all in the public sector. With on one side, you get the business and all the needs from the business needs to work. And on the other side, you get all these kind of rules and regulations and for instance, you have the FREMS 2, you have the Cloud Act, you have here in Europe, you have the GDPR with the USL and so on. We had a lot of rules nowadays that we need to take in consideration when we create and decide what we should use in the cloud service and how we handle the information and so on. So that's mainly what I'm going to focus on today and see how we can do different stuff with technology to be able to accomplish some of these laws and regulations. First of all, a little bit of about myself. My name is Anders Olsson and I work as an IT and information security advisor here at Onevinn. I have been working with Microsoft solutions around information protection for over 10 years now, starting with the first version called ADRMS, and nowadays I work with the whole spectrum of Microsoft information protection. So how do we kick this off and where do we start? If we have any rules or regulation that we need to prevent something going to the cloud, we need some kind of encryption and so on, we need to start with something. And there is no shortcuts. If we have any regulation saying that this and that is not allowed to be stored in the cloud, this and that needs to have this kind of encryption, we need to start with something. And that is that we need to classify our information to be able to determine what kind of sensitivity have this information. So for instance, I guess that all of you have seen that this is something that is released and built into Office, for example. We have the possibility to customize our information or existing information classification into Office products. Where we could have, for instance, in the GDPR perspective, if I have a file that is not related to work on my consultant PC, for instance, the football training for my daughter, and I create a document around that on my work machine, I can classify that as non-business. And when I quit my employment and so on, the company can take all my data and they can erase everything that is non-business related. With the same goes with the public information. We can classify information that is meant to be spread in public with that purpose, for instance. And my recommendation around information classification is to start with a default classification. It doesn't say if it's sensitive or not. It's just saying that this is information that belongs to this company. Nowadays, our information are moving all the time. And I got some really interesting facts for a couple of weeks ago with the fact that if you see all the information that we have in the world, 90% of this information were created in the last 2 years. That's quite interesting, right? So in the last 2 years, 90% of all the information in the world have been created. So how can it be in the next 2 years? We are in an age where we're creating information all the time from different devices and so on. We get almost unlimited with storage. And with the default classification, as soon as someone creates a document from our company, if we classify it and we get metadata that this is information that belongs to our company, which is really grateful. For instance, if you find a couple of files in the third-party cloud service on a USB drive, you can easily determine, is this information that belongs to our company or not? To that, we have the more sensitive part of information. Could be confidential or secret, highly confidential, strictly confidential, whatever you call it. And what we can do with this is we can set different rules and regulation, and we can educate our end users. For instance, if I find a document that is public, I should be educated as an end user that in a public document, I'm not allowed to have written anything that is sensitive in that kind of document, for example. And what is really great these days is this is something that is totally built in the products, meaning that you have the sensitivity button, in this case on a Windows machine. But if I switch to my iPad, for instance, I create an Excel sheet on my iPad, starting with an Excel sheet here, and I have the same functionality even on my iPad. So with that said, we can classify information regardless of what kind of device we are using. I can use my Mac machine, I can use my Linux or Unix devices, I can use an iPad, I can use, for instance, my iPhone as well. So if I open up, in this case, this is a presentation shared between Onevinn and Microsoft. In that stage, it was sensitive information, not public. I can easily open up a protected PowerPoint on my iPhone as well. It's really great, with the possibility to set the same classification when I create a new document on my iPhone. And when it comes to the laws and regulations, especially here in Sweden, there is a lot of regulations. What can you store in the cloud and what is not allowed to be stored in the cloud? With the help of the information classifications and the labels that we can create with Microsoft Information Protection, we can also use different services to prevent stuff going to the cloud. Let's take an example. I know that many of you are starting the journey with Microsoft Teams, which is a really great solution to be able to collaborate with others and sharing data and so on. Let's say that we have a strictly policy saying that certain information classes are not allowed to be stored in the cloud. Certain information is not allowed to be stored in the cloud. If I work with Teams, I can upload certain information directly to Teams, which will be stored in SharePoint Online in the backend. But if I take some documents with a higher classification, in this case, strictly secret information, trying to move the same file into Teams in the same way, it will be blocked. In this case, we are using a stuff called endpoint data loss prevention that is built into the Windows service, where we can prevent certain stuff going to different cloud services. We can prevent stuff from being moved to a USB drive, going to a network share, or whatever regulations that we have. The same goes, it's not only possible with Office files. Let's say that we have a policy saying that it's not allowed to store information with social security numbers in Teams sites where we have external guests, for example. So if I try to move up this notepad file into Teams, I get the same notification. So what we can do with endpoint DLP is that we can define what kind of apps is allowed to be used with sensitive data. For instance, if you have a sync client, the OneDrive client sync your data to Office 365. You have the Google Drive client sync the stuff to the Google, for instance. And we have the possibility to prevent certain information to be, in this case, synced to the cloud service. We can, for instance, identify certain information in a certain information class. We can replace that file, move that file to an on-premise file share instead, replacing that file with a text file, with information where they can find the files in the new location, for instance. Really good stuff. This is also something that is built into the browser from Microsoft. So we can say that in the same way that I'm blocking certain stuff going to Microsoft Teams, I can also block certain information being used by different browsers. If I got the Google Chrome, for instance, Safari or whatever, that maybe it's not allowed to be used for certain information. We can block that as well. But with the Microsoft Edge browser, we have the built-in support for endpoint DLP, which means that if I do the same thing, I go to SharePoint, I go to Teams directly through the browser instead, trying the same thing, moving up the same documents through the browser. Instead of Windows, it's a browser telling me that this is not allowed. And I also get a recommendation for you. Around DLP, which is a really great tool, but it can also be a risk of using DLP in the wrong manner. With that said, if you start blocking everything, as soon as I try to do something, I'm blocked. The biggest risk around information leakage in that case is that what I'm doing, if I can't use my work machine, of course I start using another device instead, and maybe some other unsanctioned cloud apps to do my work. So DLP is a really great tool, but it should not just be used for blocking. You can start using DLP just for notification in the first phase. And it's really important that you instruct and inform your end users. If you block anything, you should have something with instruction how they should do their work instead. So in this case, you see that I use the same thing. I'm blocking, but I give the end user the possibility to override. So we can do that as well. And that's maybe a better start than stopping everything. In this case, I have the possibility to override, but this is logged and so on. It doesn't block everything in this case. And now you're thinking, okay, you're talking about something that's built into Windows. We're not only using Windows, and we need to use other devices without using corp devices. We can solve that as well. Let's take the same example. We're using endpoint DLP on all the corporate devices. But let's say that we allow users to use a home machine in these days. I'm starting up a new browser on my home machine. This is not a corporate device. In this case, I go to teams.microsoft.com, and we have a conditional access rule in this case, saying that if you don't use a corp device, we use what is called a session control, saying that I go to teams.microsoft.com and we're met by this. Okay, this session is monitored, and we're using a combination of conditional access in Azure AD together with a solution called Microsoft Cloud App Security, which can inspect the content. And we can define the same rules, saying that these kind of files with these kind of information or these information classes are not allowed to be stored in the cloud. Or the other way around. If you're not using a corporate device, should you be allowed to download everything on that device? You can define the same thing. For certain information classes are not allowed to be downloaded on a non-corporate device. So let's take a look. If I continue in this case as an end user, I get a really nice experience going to Teams. But if you look at the URL path, you see that I'm not going to teams.microsoft.com. I'm going to amcas.ms in this case, saying that this traffic are monitored by amcas. So in the same case, if I try to upload a file to Teams, it works. But if I do the strictly secret information part, it's blocked, in this case by amcas instead. If you do the other way around, I can download certain information on my non-corporate device. But if I try with the secret information, it blocked, in this case as well, by the amcas solution. And we can actually look at the session itself, saying that I try to have a policy that stop leaking passwords. My password is, hit send, and we block this action before it is sent to the cloud. Really great stuff. When it comes to the encryption part, as I said before, our information are moving all the time. We can't have only DLP saying that this information is not allowed to be stored, because our information can, in some cases, maybe ended up in a sanctioned cloud service or a non-sanctioned cloud service. And with the encryption part, we achieve that regardless of where this file have been stored, have been moved, is encrypted with only permission for the one is defined for that file. For instance, only employees at that company can access that file, regardless if it's stored on a Google service or a iCloud service or whatever, or a home machine. If you don't have a company account, you can't open that. And what kind of options do we have? First of all, when you create and start using Microsoft Information Protection, which using Azure Rights Management in the backend, you get a default key. Manage control by Microsoft. You don't need to do anything. Just not that, just working. You have all the benefits and all the functions and so on. I don't need to care about your encryption key. If you have rules and regulations saying that for our company, we need to create our own keys for encryption. We are not allowed to use third-party key encryption. Okay, then we have an option to use bring your own key, where we can create our own key with an HSM. Ian is going to talk more about that later on. But what we are doing with an HSM is that I can buy an HSM, I can create my own key on my HSM. To be able to use the cloud service, I can transfer those keys to Microsoft and their HSM, because Microsoft need to have the key to be able to do the encryption part and the decryption part, to be able to use all the great stuff in the cloud, for instance. But the biggest difference with bring your own key and the default key is that, first of all, the key is created by you, and you get a detailed log exactly how your key is used, and it's secured in the HSM world, saying that it can't be extracted, but Microsoft can still use it and get the log for it. When it comes to the Cloud Act and FRAMS 2 and so on, if you need to have an encryption key that is not accessible by Microsoft, you have an option to use what is called the hold your own key. Previously, we used the ADRMS for this, but that is only in the on-prem, in the your own local AD, saying that if you should encrypt something to another user, it needs to be another user in your organization. But with these days, we need to be able to encrypt files to other organizations as well. Therefore, we have a new solution called double key encryption. That is using the great stuff that we have with Azure Rights Management, saying that we can encrypt all kind of files to all kind of users. So I can protect a file to Onevinn and Entrust, for instance. But we also get an encryption key for the information itself by your encryption service. That is not accessible, for instance, from Microsoft or any third party. So the combination of these encryption keys is that the content itself is encrypted by your service. You can limit exactly who can use it. And then the content key that is encrypted by your service is then again encrypted by the Azure Rights Management, where you can control in a sensitivity label who can access this. Internal users, external users, what kind of domains, and so on, and determine who can access the information. And during a decryption, you need to go to the Azure AD, verify, do you have the access or not? And if you have the access, it's going back to your DK service. Do you have the possibility to open this or not? Until you get the content key that encrypts the actual content. I'm not going to go deeper than that. If you're interested to view all the thing, how the DK works in the backend and so on, we get another webinar on that. So we will include a link for that afterwards. Okay, how do you using this? First of all, you shouldn't protect all your information. You should only protect your most sensitive information. And if you want to have full functionality, for instance, with protection of files inside of Teams, to be able to co-authorize with files, with SharePoint, Teams, and so on, you need to use the Microsoft key or the Bring Your Own Key service. Marks don't need to have access to the key to provide that kind of service. But for that information that is highly sensitive or are not allowed to be encrypted by the Microsoft key service, in that case, they're using the double key encryption. What we have done is that we have built a DK service built on a Microsoft PKI. What is really important here is if you should manage your keys, it's your responsibility. And it's not only including the technology around key handling and key creation. It's also about policies, routines. How do you manage this? And by integrate this with the Microsoft PKI, we can include this in the existing routines. How do you renew your certificates today, and so on. And with that, we can also encrypt and control the encryption key for the DK service. And what could it be better to store the keys, except in an HSM? So with that said, I'm going to leave the word over to you, Ina, and please do the introduction and tell us everything that we need to know about an HSM.
Okay, thank you, Anders. So this is really practical and useful information around how you can, protect the data and information within the organization. So let me share the presentation first. So, by the way, my name is Ena from the Entrust. I'm a senior solution consultant from the data protection solutions within the Entrust. And I have a specialized, I am specialized with the HSM technology over 15 years. And the Microsoft Azure facilitates the very high level of security by default, as Anders already mentioned from the practical side. But in some cases, like he says also, the organizations still face some difficulties migrating the sensitive data to Azure. And it's often, because of the security policy or regulation within the country or due to the compliance reason and so on. And separation of the risks and also the demonstration of your own control and the management is the important factor in the security design, especially when you're going through the audit or the compliance and so on. And it's not easy to demonstrate these when it comes to the shared and third-party environment, such as in the cloud, like in Azure environment. So I'd like to talk about these possible ways of managing encryption in Azure without compromising security or without compromising your own control or compliance. So the encryption is, as you know, the fundamental mechanism to prevent the unauthorized access to the data. However, we should also remember this is based on the concept that secret keys are protected always and also controlled by its owner. The Microsoft service, such as, for example, the double key encryption Anders mentioned, for example, utilize the customer's own key to encrypt the content encryption keys. In other words, the file content itself can be only read by the customer themselves. Even the Microsoft Azure data center staff cannot see the content of the data. But what if they are stored in the same service provider environment? And what if there's a possibility that the secret key can be compromised? It is really difficult to demonstrate your own control in such environment, even it doesn't be compromised. And the same applies in any other technologies utilizing the cryptography or encryption in general. The hardware security module, HSMs we provide, is the device which isolates the cryptographic keys and the crypto operations away from the rest of the system. HSM has a special protected motherboard, which has all components inside this motherboard is protected with the special coating. So the something or the data stored inside HSM, including the runtime environment or memory, is going to be destroyed if you physically try to destroy or leak the data from the memory. So if you generate the encryption keys inside this HSM under this protection, and if you use them also inside HSM, these encryption keys will be used under this always the protection, so never exposed to the outside world. And HSM also enforces the independent access control within the HSM and the layered security around the cryptographic keys. So by using the HSM system and the process around it will automatically also comply to the security best practice, such as strong authentication or segregation of the duties or separation of the risk and so on. And that helps organizations to meet the various industry standards and security regulations you face. And so the owner of the HSM will be also able to demonstrate your own protection and the full control of the data encryption keys. And of course, the data that key is protecting. The cloud integration achieves a lot of benefit, such as flexibility, scalability, the faster deployment. As Anders mentioned, you can do the same thing as on your work PC and on your iPad as well. But without good strategy and a good detailed planning, it may also end up, much more cost than expected, or far worse is the lack of security actually. The lack of compliance or extra cost for the audit may also stop the migration even in a halfway in some cases. In order to generate the good strategy and the planning, organization first needs to go through all of the data and classify the sensitivity as Anders mentioned. So they can clearly see the different level of control that is required for the each classified data. And I think in many cases, majority of the data falls into the non-sensitive data bucket. So you can just, have moved to the cloud environment without any concern. And around 15% of data in average may falls into the sensitive bucket. And this sort of data can be protected by, for example, Azure Key Vault to have a very good auditability, which is the key management service Anders also mentioned in Microsoft Azure. And if you need to demonstrate also your own control, in this case, you can use the bring your own key on the Azure Key Vault. Once your own keys will be uploaded in the Azure Key Vault, then there will be no change in the process of the using Key Vault. But you will be able to demonstrate your own control by managing your keys own life cycle and according to your own security policy as well. And finally, the last bucket of the data is highly sensitive. And this is, the only a small part of the data, like 5%, but some data labeled as highly confidential or sensitive may require to be entirely isolated from the third-party access, and whether due to the internal reason or a regional compliance reason, and so on. And this is where DKE comes into scope. So once you go through the data classification properly, organization can take actually the multiple routes of controlling the data protection and to deploy their own strategy. So in the bring your own key scenario in Azure Key Vault, you will typically generate a key using your own on-prem HSM, upload that to the dedicated Key Vault to your tenant key. And after the generation, HSM on-prem still have to protect your keys and manage it and making sure it's always backed up and available when it's needed. And as you will rekey or revoke your tenant key in the Key Vault under your own control. And the tenant key uploaded through the Key Vault API can be used for the various services, not only protecting the Microsoft 365 documents, but also in the generally in the Azure information protection, as well as the SQL Server transparent data encryption, always encrypted, and some other application in Gallery also supports the Key Vault interface. And the same set of HSM or the independent set of HSM, may be also dealing with the highly sensitive data. And using the modernized HSM environment and APIs, HSMs in the external network, such as in your own country, can also manage the the encryption as well as the DKE encryption as well as the key vault. In the case of the DKE, customers' own DKE instance and the key store can be facilitated outside Azure, which means you can have it on-prem or in the third-party environment and within your own country or region. And that service, DKE service, can interact with the Office 365 client to protect the contents. And by making use of the HSM interface, such as REST API, or having the VPN connection, point to point, or the site-to-site VPN connection to the Azure, allows external HSM also to interact with various applications and virtual machines in Azure directly as well. So this is useful in the case if you have the custom application in a VM deployed in the Azure side. And the same application could be also deployed in a multi-cloud environment and interfaced by the HSM externally. Enshield product line HSMs are one of the most trusted general purpose HSM in the market. And all models of the Enshield HSMs are FIPS 140-2 Level 3 certified. And some of the models are also certified for the common criteria EAL4 based on European eIDAS profile. So they're often used by many European trusted service providers too. Enshield Edge, USB-connected small HSM on the left-hand side, is popular as the HSM for example, for the root CA, offline root CA, or also HSMs used for the cloud bring your own key, such as Azure Key Vault. In the same organization, if they use the HSM for the multiple purposes, such as both for bring your own key and the DKE and so on, then the network appliance model in Enshield Connect in the middle supports the multiple applications facilitated by the higher performance and automatic clustering and HA and so on. And Enshield Connect is actually also offered as a managed service in our data center too. All Enshield models share the common keys framework and various application interface that allows customers to mix the different models in order to form a big security domain for the entire organization. We provide this highly adjustable and scalable HSM options so that customer can rely on the hardware-based foundation of the trust, regardless of the application locations, such as on-prem or in the public cloud or in hybrid or even multi-cloud environment. In order to support various needs of the key management in the cloud or in the on-prem or in third-party environment, Enshield HSM supports multiple key management interface that allows customers to enforce the common and centralized security policy. Cloud Integration Option Pack is for customers who are going to manage your data in the cloud using the bring your own key method. It helps the customers, to generate and upload the key with easy steps using any of the Enshield models I mentioned. Web Service Option Pack allows your application in the cloud, such as virtual image or container environment, to interact with the HSM using the RESTful interface, which facilitate really easy access to the core security functions. In the same time, removes any footprint of the HSM software from your application side. Enshield as a service, we call it NSAS in short, offers the same Enshield HSMs I've mentioned as managed service instead of owning the physical HSM on your own data center. Container option pack helps the containerized application to leverage the orchestrated scalability or easy deployment while sharing the backbone HSM resource for the core security foundation. Most of the case, organization will also have to go through the long period of the hybrid phase when they're migrating the system into the cloud, where some applications are still on-prem environment in their own data centers, and the other application may be already deployed in the public cloud environment. So the migration plan also has to be able to avoid the security compromise during this period. And one of the best way is to first establish the common and centralized security policy, as well as the key management interface. The centralized key management system serving all the sensitive data within the organization on-prem normally is backed by the cluster of the HSMs. During the migration, existing HSMs can be adapted with the additional layer, such as VPN or REST API interface, so that they can communicate also with application in the cloud. So utilizing the options like bring your own key or DKE, the organization will be able to enforce the policy across the different application and the different network, including the public Azure environment. Eventually, the HSM can be also migrated to the service-based environment, such as ENSAS, if that's applicable from the compliance or regulation point of view. By separating the core foundation of the security infrastructure from the application segment itself, organization will be able to enforce its policy throughout the migration process, first of all. In the same time, this configuration will be the cloud exit ready or cloud provider agnostic, if that's also part of your requirement. Ensure service is already available both in Europe and in USA. And for organizations who requires to manage your own encryption keys, yet probably wish to minimize the unnecessary investment on-prem, ENSAS offers the independent and dedicated HSM to simply replace the on-prem environment. ENSAS is the public cloud independent and dedicated HSM, so you can also run your custom code inside HSM in the certified secure boundary if that's needed. In addition, ENSAS has the same HSM interface with a common key management framework as all the other Ensure product line has, which means you don't need to have even the on-prem backup devices because Ensure HSM also backs up your keys automatically. And migration from the on-prem to the ENSAS or vice versa will be seamless. Or you can run the BOSS environment, ENSAS environment, as well as the on-prem environment in the same time as a cluster to back up each other. In ENSAS, you can also choose either self-managed option or fully managed option. With the self-managed option, it will be quite similar to accessing your own HSM in your own, subcontracted data center. In this option, your organization will administrate and authorize HSM remotely, also using the multiple smart card to have the separation of the duties of physical token presentation if you want. And only the hardware will be maintained by the data center staff in order to protect your secrets and existing process. So although the HSM will be physically be located and managed by ourselves, our data center staff 24/7, so you will have benefit of not worrying about the hardware issue, replacement of the hardware, the firmware upgrades, or physical security into data center and so on. Fully managed option will save your organization's cost and effort, having the deep technical knowledge around the cryptography and the key management, because we are the expert on the cryptography and key management. And once the HSM are configured, it will be fully automatic process for applications to make use of the encryption keys. So the difference of the NSAS compared to the, for example, the dedicated HSMs in the Azure data center, for example, is going to be the HSMs are in the separate infrastructure from your public cloud provider, like Azure. And your HSM can be used for the multiple public cloud environment. So if your application in the container, template is deployed in the AWS and Azure and Google Cloud, you can also utilize the NSAS HSM to 3 of these, environment. And you can also coexist with the private clouds or own data centers as well. So Entrust data protection solution, where I belong, has the very deep expertise and track record in cryptography and has over 20 years of experience providing the root of trust to the various systems. And HSM is the technology basically provides the trust or integrity or control to the various systems. And I think you were surprised to see how much of your digital environment already is depending on the core security foundation protected by such hardware like HSMs. This application could be, for example, the government PKIs, enterprise PKIs, or digital signatures, or citizen authentications, or digital payments, for example. And the trust and integrity nowadays often also be used in the device-to-device communication in the IoT environment, or in the government digital currencies based on the distributed ledgers or the blockchain technologies and so on. And our experience is already proven by more than 1,000 major players in the world. So thanks for sharing time with us today. And here are the links and the contact details in this slide in the case you want to know further details. And now I can close up my part of the presentation too. And I think we have enough time to take your questions, Anders.
Yeah, I also invite my colleague Olav, who manages this webinar.
Yes. So we have a couple of questions here. I think we can start with the first one. If we move our SQL data into the cloud, how can we best keep in control of the security aspects?
Yes, so I think I can answer the question.
Super.
And basically the key to decide which key management option is the best depends on the content of the SQL data and data itself. So it's not about the database, but the data itself has to be the reason to decide. So in the content of the data, in the case that SQL database includes the very sensitive data, then the option could be, for example, the Azure Key Vault using the bring your own key option. And I think that TDE, transparent data encryption enabled database or always encrypted is enabled in the database. In such cases, you can use the Key Vault keys to manage, and you can also generate your own keys for the Key Vault. And I think that applies for also the PostgreSQL servers protected by the Key Vault as well.
Thank you. And there was one follow-up on that. Are there any SQL delays or lack of features caused by BYOKey?
Yes, so I can also answer that question. And the bring your own key is just simply replacing the Azure managed key with the customer generated key. So after the point that you have uploaded your tenant key into the Azure Key Vault, every process up until you actually revoke that key is going to be the same as the other service managed keys. So there will be no inference by using your own key, first of all. And the Key Vault is protecting just, in the case transparent data encryption, it's just protecting the, wallet master key. So there will be no, consequences or delay because of using this keyboard or your own keys.
Thank you. One more question that came in is, how can we identify sensitive information in Azure SQL or Azure Storage blobs?
Yeah, I can take that one. That's actually quite new stuff, actually. There is a preview going on right now called Azure Purview, which doing exactly that. We have integrated, or Microsoft integrated, the Microsoft Information Protection part and the sensitivity labeling feature to be able to monitor Azure Storage, Azure SQL, and so on, to monitor the information in the same way as you're doing right now with your documents or by using the endpoint TLP and so on. So my recommendation is to take a look at that preview because it's a public preview and you can test it right away.
Super. Thank you. And one more question is, what features do we miss in Office 365 when we use DKE?
Yeah, that's actually quite a lot. That's why I also mentioned that DK is not the purpose to use for all your information. Since Microsoft doesn't have access to the keys, all the online functions will stop working. With that said, for instance, if you're using the Teams client, nothing happens on your device. Everything is managed by SharePoint Online. If you try to open up anything that's protected by DK, it will simply say that you need to open this Word, Excel, PowerPoint file through your real app instead, using the modern or the Office Pro Plus client. So simply that, think that all the DK information need to be opened by the real Office app. And today it's working with the Windows Office version, Office for Windows. In the roadmap, we're going to support Office for Mac, Office for iOS, and so on. So that's still in roadmap.
Yep. Super. That's a good answer. And can you explain a bit more on how the DKE encryption works?
I actually think it's better if you send a link to the webinar that we focused on the DK encryption, have a look at that.
Yeah, we will do that. That sounds like a good idea.
Yeah.
And finally then, before we end this, do we have some more recommendations on how we should approach such a project for when you want to take action or get more in control of your sensitive data in Azure?
That's a big one. My first recommendation will be to be sure that you have included the business as a part of this kind of project. What we have seen and in our experience, when organizations have failed with this kind of implementation, it's always that this has been driven as an IT project. So with that said, you need to have all the business needs and business requirements, and the business need to be part of the project from the start. So that's one really important takeaway from this.
Yeah, that's really important. Well, thank you. I think that was the questions that we got. So, well, I'll just maybe we should end it here. You have our contact informations, and feel free to reach out if there are any. If you want some more information, we can take a separate meeting for that. And I will thank you too for a good presentation. It's been really interesting to hear. And bye to you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye bye.